Test, 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 test. You seeing some levels, but when I wasn't speaking, you weren't getting anything?
Can you turn it down? I've got it cranked down as far as I can here.
Okay, so you're taking what, left side?
Yeah. Yeah.
Left. Okay. Where is our... Left out. First we'll turn this guy off. Test, test, test. Check, check, check. Huh. Still too hot for you? Yeah, okay. Where are the main left and right channel? Oh, duh. We want to choose the main. And test, 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 test. Check, check, check. Check, check, check.
Can you crank it down?
I'm trying to. I'm trying to pan it away from you're on the left feed, right? So I'm panning it to the right. 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Test 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 test. Check 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 check. Test test test.
That's good.
Okay. So I'm just gonna bring this out to the room proper. Ooh. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna have to bring down everything that's going out the right channel, anyways. So, dun, 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 dun. Where's that coming from outside? Okay. Test, test, test. Check, check, check. 1 2. Was that? Yeah, it's okay for you? Okay, and what I was hearing was apparently something's happening outside that's producing a background hum-like noise, just long enough that I was going, oh no! No, it was literally when you were saying it was okay, and I was listening for the room, and I was hearing myself here, but also hearing this low background sort of, and I was like, ah, crap. Too much going out the right side means that we're getting like a little bit of feedback of some sort, and with me as loud as I am, we'd be getting something a little bit more obvious, I'm sure, by now.
Okay. Thanks, man. I think the opening remarks and the speaker, I think the debate, they're not going to go up. Okay. So it will be the first two. I don't think 3 and 4 are going up. They go if they want, but I don't think they're going up. Okay. It's flying up for the Terminator.
Bienvenue. Bienvenue tout le monde. J'aimerais vous inviter à vous asseoir. Bon après-midi. Je m'appelle Monica Gattinger. Je suis directrice de l'Institut de recherche sur la science, la société et la politique publique et présidente de l'initiative Énergie positive. Je suis ravie de présenter ce panel cet après-midi. L'événement va se dérouler en anglais, mais si jamais vous avez des questions en français, soyez-vous bien à l'aise de les poser en français, puis je pourrai les traduire pour notre panel. Welcome to the University of Ottawa, to those of you here in the room, and also to those of you who are joining us via live stream. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be holding this panel here today. 3 years ago, we had a vision at the University of Ottawa to create an initiative that we call Positive Energy. Positive Energy has a mandate to strengthen public confidence in energy decision-making, whether that's at the level of policy, planning, regulation, or individual projects. We do that by using the convening power of the university to bring together leaders from business, from government, from civil society, from the academy, from Indigenous organizations, and we undertake solution-focused, applied academic research. It was supposed to be a 3-year project, but after 3 years, we had many of our funders and others in the network really encouraging us to continue with this work, and so that is what we have decided to do, and this public panel this afternoon kicks off some of that work. Over the course of the 3 years that Positive Energy has been in existence, we have a growing network and list of supporters, many of whom are here in the room today. Alberta Energy, the Alberta Energy Regulator, the British Columbia Oil and Gas Commission, the British Columbia Utilities Commission, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the Canadian Wind Energy Association, the Canadian Electricity Association, the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, the Canadian Gas Association, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, Cenovus in Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Starting to become a very long list, and we're absolutely delighted for that. We couldn't undertake the events that we do and the research that we do without the support financially of these organizations. So 3 years after we started this initiative, and we're launching a second phase of Positive Energy, this time focused on public confidence in energy transition decision-making. Canada represents a very particular context for energy transition. The country has vast energy resources. We have large oil and gas reserves. In fact, the largest petroleum reserves in the world of any Western industrialized democracy. Energy resources in the country are regionally distributed. We are a federation with energy largely under provincial jurisdiction. We're an open economy, and we're a well-established democracy, which places a sharp focus on the legitimacy of decision-making arrangements, hence the importance of public confidence in energy decisions, how those are taken, and that's ultimately the rationale for Positive Energy. As we've seen over the last number of months, there's growing polarization around issues of energy and climate in the country, over what Canada's energy future should be, over how transition to lower-emitting energy systems should be undertaken, over who should be leading the charge, the federal government or provincial governments, over what decision-making arrangements should look like for energy and resources development, over which instruments should be utilized to transition the country to a lower-emitting energy system. In fact, the stage is set for very contentious politics on energy and climate. Part of what we do at Positive Energy is unpack these challenges. This event, the public panel this evening, is part of a small group workshop that we're holding at Positive Energy, where we're bringing together leaders from across the country. Anybody who you see in the room today with a name tag on, they're part of that workshop, so please feel free to introduce yourselves to them. And one of the things that we're discussing at this workshop is polarization. Its sources, its consequences, impacts on energy decision-making, and most importantly, how to address it. If it's polarized in terms of the context for decision-making, it can be very difficult to build durable policy and regulation. And we can have swings in energy policy and regulation, which we've seen over the last number of months, which aren't necessarily conducive to building public confidence in decision-making. We're very fortunate today to have an outstanding panel to begin to explore these issues. We will begin with a keynote by Nick Nanos. Nick is one of Canada's leading public opinion researchers. He's been and remains an absolutely outstanding friend of positive energy. He's also published a book on the topic of polarization called The Age of Voter Rage, available at fine booksellers near you. Nick will deliver a keynote on polarization as a more general phenomenon, and after that we will have some responses from senior leaders in the energy sector who are actually living the worlds of polarization in their daily lives. The first will be Dale Boojum. Dale lives this out at the policy level as Executive Director of Canada's Fiscal Commission, which has focused extremely efficiently and effectively on issues of carbon pricing. And he'll share with us the experiences of the Fiscal Commission in, when it comes to polarized contexts. And I must say, Dale, I can't think of I don't know if the word better or worse is right for a discussion of carbon pricing and polarization, but we certainly are in a period where it's very sharply divided. We then are very lucky to have with us as well Lisa DeMarco from DeMarco Allen LLP, who lives and breathes these issues at the regulatory and judicial level with her work in the energy sector, particularly on energy, environment, and climate. On your chairs are the biographies of each of our speakers, so I won't eat into our time by reading those bios, but I invite you to consult them. So we're going to begin with the keynote by Nick, and then we'll call up Dale and Lisa. Each of Dale and Lisa will share some remarks with us, and then we'll move into a moderated discussion. So Nick, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Monica. You know, it's interesting. You know, I'm here at a positive energy event, but it's fairly clear from my first slide that things aren't very positive when you see the fists pumping in the air and the fire. And that speaks to what I'll say the broader environment that we are in related to polarization and frustration. And I know we're here to talk about energy, but the reality is that you could pick a number of public policy issues. You could talk about energy and pipelines and public acceptance of projects as one particular polarization point or frustration. Or you could talk about immigration. You could talk about globalization. You should think of energy as not something super special. It's just another touch point that polarizes many citizens and galvanizes opinion. And many times when I talk about these forces, I usually talk about the subcontext, not just about populism, but about the establishment and how many citizens, not just in Canada, but around the world, when you unpack many of these movements, they manifest themselves differently. But the one commonality that they have is an anti-establishment thread. What does that mean? That means that they feel that perhaps their provincial or federal government has let them down. That means that perhaps citizens feel that they do everything right, but that they cannot get ahead economically. Perhaps that means that when a project comes to their community or neighborhood or region, that they feel that they are at a disadvantage because the establishment powers, large companies, governments, and so forth, have a disproportionate influence in moving forward with projects, and that they feel that they're at a particular disadvantage. You know, I'm always quite interested when I kind of hear what I'll call the general narrative related to many of the elections. And many times if I was to summarize elections, it would be, what were they thinking? It would just be those 4 words. When people hear about, what happened in the United States or what's going on in Italy. And many times these elections are discounted, right? The populists or the anti-establishment forces, whether they be from the right or the left, are dismissed, and it's kind of like, whew, wow, we didn't have to worry about that. But the reality is that when you actually unpack almost every major election in Western democracies lately, you see the phenomenon of what I would call creeping populism. I remember when I read the media reports of the Dutch election, people were quite relieved. Actually, the market was quite relieved also in terms of, how the far right had not done well. Well, yes, they did not win the election, but they made a gain. And actually, it'd be fair to say that when we think of those anti-establishment populist-style movements, that it would be fair to say that even though in many elections they did not win, that they made gains. They made gains in the German election, in the Italian election. I would put Obrador in that same category as anti-establishment. Like, we have a leader in Mexico who at one time encouraged people not to pay their electricity bills. And you also have the same kind of movement in Sweden, progressive, tolerant Sweden, where you have the Swedish Democrats increasing support. And even when you look at the last federal election in France, that an election that was held up as a paradigm of what I'll say tolerance and progressiveness and how it had overcome the other forces of the right of Le Pen, and I would say the far left of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, that when you unpack the numbers, even when you compare Le Pen and how she did compared to her father, this was a gain for the right wing. That not only did she win a significant greater number of votes than her father did, she managed to make gains in the National Assembly and actually enter the National Assembly herself. So what I want to actually put on the table is that we should not be complacent when these populist anti-establishment forces do not win with thinking that they have gone away. The reality is that they are a symptom. They're not necessarily the cause. They're a symptom of other broader problems and a structural challenge, I would say, for our democracy today. And even when you look in Canada, Boojum, Maxime Bernier and Doug Ford, when you unpack the Ford election in Ontario, yes, a significant part of that was an electorate kind of making a judgment on a tired Liberal government, for sure. That was definitely part of it. But when you kind of unpack the style of Doug Ford, I found it quite interesting as a political observer. I think it would be fair to say that if you were to ask an average citizen about what the platform for a conservative party would be, usually it would include things like numbers and details. No, and I don't say that in a negative way, but the thing is that for Doug Ford, he understood that he did not need to get into the details on a costed platform. He knew that he actually only had to have 5 bullets and some talking points. He knew that he could just basically talk about a buck of beer as a symbolic gesture, firing the CEO of Hydro One as a symbolic gesture of what was wrong with the establishment, and to tap into that anxiety about how the system had let people down, and that he could coast through the election without having to defend a detailed policy platform or even have a costed platform. So from my perspective, at least, he understands that. Even when we look at someone like Maxime Bernier, I'd call him the latest entrant on the populist front, at least in Canada. Although right now it's clear that not a lot of Canadians are embracing Maxime Bernier or even know that he has a party. About 10% of Canadians said that they would consider voting for him. But the thing is that when we unpack what he is trying to do, it's very similar in style to what we've seen in other countries, where he basically has a narrative that the establishment party, for him the main focus is the Federal Conservative Party of Canada, that they are ideologically bankrupt and lost their way, and that they have let things down. That Maxime Bernier, I'm sure, will want to position himself as a disruptor, to say that the system is not working, vote for me, and I will definitely disrupt things in the House of Commons. But you know, many times I'm asked, and I'm sure you get asked whenever you travel, is Canada really different? And you know, I think a lot of this was in the context of the last federal election. We had the, I'll call it now, very famous sunny ways of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, a commitment to run a campaign that was very positive, that did not degenerate into many of the negative kind of campaign tactics that we've seen in the past. And he won. And I think for a lot of people outside of Canada, and I would say even for people inside of Canada, they were surprised that someone could not try to negatively tear down your opponents and malign them, and to stay positive and to still win. But one of the things I'd like you to remember is that, you know, it's interesting when we poll in terms of the subcontext of how Canadians are feeling right now. You have to think of what the government asserts in terms of its positive view and sunny ways, but let's unpack for a second how Canadians feel about the government in Ottawa. This is actually a variation of a question that's done by the Pew Institute for Democracy and the People. And it asks citizens, which of the following feelings describes your views of the federal government in Ottawa? Not of Justin Trudeau, not of the Liberal Party, but of the federal government. You can see full 1/2 or 1 out of every 2 Canadians use words like pessimism or anger. You can imagine 1 out of every 4 Canadians use the word anger to describe the emotion that they feel about Ottawa. That would be like walking downtown Main Street in an average town or city in Canada and thinking that 1 out of every 4 Canadians would say, yes, anger is how I feel. That's the emotion I feel when I think of the government in Ottawa. And you can see only about 1 out of every 3 have positive views, either saying that they're optimistic or satisfied or disinterested. You can see at 8%. It's kind of akin to the road rage, right? Like you're on the road and then all of a sudden someone snaps. You make an inadvertent turn of your automobile. You know, it's a completely innocent mistake, but then you realize just beneath that friendly veneer of all your other friends on the road that there's a level of anger and emotion that snaps at the smallest provocation. So you should think of that in terms of the emotional kind of frame right now. You know, Monica talked about frustration and polarization. Think of these types of emotions not below the surface, but basically at the surface. And what's interesting, I think at least, when we come at this particular phenomenon, and perhaps interesting is the wrong word, worrisome might be a better word, is what I'm calling the delineation for many voters on how they consume information. You know, it's interesting, I'm sure like many of you in the last election in the United States were probably watching, you know, what was happening with Donald Trump. And then we had those famous rallies that were kind of, I don't know what words I'd like to use to describe them, but they're quite interesting events. Why don't we say that? Donald Trump would, for example, talk about building a wall, or he'd talk about locking up Hillary Clinton, and the crowd would respond. There was a very interesting analysis in the Washington Post related to this, where the Washington Post basically unpacked what I'll say voters into 2 broad categories. Voters that literally listened to Donald Trump, and voters that symbolically listened to Donald Trump. And if you were a literal voter, when Donald Trump said that he would build a wall, you would ask questions like, how long will that wall be? How tall will that wall be? How much will that wall cost? Will this wall achieve our public policy objectives? And then you say, that sounds like a stupid idea. If you were symbolic if you're a symbolic voter or someone that consumed the information symbolically, you would hear we're going to build a wall, and you wouldn't get into the details. You wouldn't be asking all those questions. You would be focusing on the symbolism of what Donald Trump was trying to say, that he will keep people out of the United States and try to protect jobs. So, you know, many times when I'm talking to kind of stakeholders, especially in the energy sector, which is rich with stakeholders who are engineers and evidence-based, I try to say stuff like, you know, you think that if you have one more proof point, you will just persuade people. If you have one more piece of evidence that has been documented, that the people in the community will rise up and embrace your project as something that's wonderful. When the reality is that for a significant proportion of these citizens, they don't really care what the evidence is. They are focused on the symbolic meaning of what a project means for them. So when you think of this polarization movement, you have to think of almost, in a Shakespearean sense, two solitudes, not able to talk to each other. This would be like the conversation, Jeff, we were talking about this a little earlier, it'd be like two voters disagreeing on something, one voter being evidenced and literal, and the other one being symbolic. How can you reconcile those two positions? You know, from my perspective, I'm going to say that it's very difficult to reconcile them. And actually, usually my recommendation is to say, you know what, if you have a project or you want to advance an initiative, yes, you must have the facts. Yes, you must have evidence. But where's your symbolic messaging? Where's the emotion that you're trying to connect with people in order to get them to support what you're doing? And if that's not worrisome enough, you should think about, I'll call it the mistruths out there. Oxford University has been doing some exceptional research, peer-reviewed research, on junk news and fake news and misinformation. And it was interesting, according to Oxford University, in the week before the Michigan vote in the US presidential race, in the state of Michigan, which was one of the 3 states that actually determined the outcome of the US presidential election, the ratio of real news to junk or fake news was 1-to-1. In Germany, it was 4-to-1. 4 news articles online from professional organizations to 1 fake or junk news. And the same thing in France. And we should take these numbers quite seriously because it takes very small swings in voters to have a disproportionate impact on the outcome. So think of it this way. You have the issue of symbolic versus literal messaging and the disconnect on that front. You have the growing success of fake news, junk news, and mistruths. And then on top of that, you remember the internet? You know, for many of us, I remember I was a politics student when the internet started. And I remember thinking there will be this wonderful thing called the internet. You know, whenever a politician says a lie, it'll be type, oh, that's a lie. I will be able to validate things because the truth will be on the internet. But the thing is that the reality is that that has been far from the truth. That for not just do we have fake news and junk news, but that in a world of computational propaganda where elections can be gamed, and social media can be gamed. It's interesting, according to Oxford University, I think this is a great turn of phrase, 1/3 of all Trump followers on Twitter were not human. Yeah. Actually, 1/5 of Hillary Clinton followers on Twitter were actually not human. They were bots created to retweet, amplify messages of what I'll say the folks in their tribe and Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So as we kind of unpack things, you have this disconnect in terms of literal versus symbolic messaging. You have the growing rise of fake news and misinformation, and also people that are just not willing to believe the truth. You have the gaming of social media, and think of online sources as the primary source for many citizens to find out information. But what's interesting when you kind of dig beneath the numbers is that from a research perspective, and Monica, I think this is something we should try to unpack a little more. You know, traditionally we focus on regional variations, gender variations, income variations. Actually, the emerging new division in society is actually educational attainment. High school education or college education. And you can see here, this is a chart that was done up by the BBC using data from the Office of National Statistics. They had 1,070 wards in England and Wales, and you can see that there's a direct correlation between leave and remain and your level of education. And just to put a finer point on this, you know, it's interesting, in the during the Brexit vote, there were two primary propositions. The one proposition by the Remain folks, people don't remember this very much, but the Remain forces said that if the United Kingdom left the European Union, that each household would take a negative hit of £4,300. The Brexiteers famously said that they could repatriate £350 million a week for the National Health Service. It's plastered all over the side of their bus. You know, the interesting thing, and I don't think this happens very often, but during the course of the Brexit vote leading up to the referendum, the National Statistical Agency issued a press release saying that the Brexit claim of £350 million a week was not correct. You can imagine if StatsCan had released a piece of evidence to say that one of the political parties had been misleading voters. But what actually makes this even more interesting, or perhaps scary, is that polling was done after the correction by the National Statistical Agency, and the polling tested on both of the claims. And they asked voters in the United Kingdom about 7 to 10 days out from their actual vote, do you believe or not believe each of the claims? The proportion of people that believed, I'll call it the lie, as defined by the National Statistical Agency, 47%, almost 1 out of every 2 voters. The proportion of voters or citizens that believed the truth, 17%. This speaks to some of the fundamental structural problems in terms of the environment that we're living in. That perhaps one of the things we should be thinking about is that frustration might, I don't like to use the word trump, but I guess I have to. Frustration perhaps trumps evidence in a lot of these instances. So, it's my last slide. Where are we? Oh, this is my alarm going off. So, where are we? 3 things I'd like to leave on the table. You should think of frustration as being primarily driven by economic anxiety. In the 6 years leading up to the Brexit vote, real wages had gone down by 10% and the cost of living had gone up 20%. Actually, when we look at Canada right now, more than 1 out of every 2 Canadians think that the next generation will have a lower standard of living, and only about 10% believe that we will have a higher standard of living. And this is within what I'll say the positive attitude of the government, the sunny ways, very good macroeconomic numbers. I guess one way you could describe this is joyless prosperity, that people see macroeconomic numbers, but they just don't connect to how they feel about the future. Second of all, polarization and increasing polarization, fueled by what I'll say an anti-establishment cynicism, and added to that kind of fake news where individuals can be in their own echo chamber, then it's very difficult to reach. And finally, what I'll call uncertainty. And what I mean by uncertainty is that, you know, prior to this technological age, unless you really had a true movement, it was hard to mobilize. But now with the internet, social media, Facebook, Twitter, you are basically only a click away from mobilizing a group in order to oppose a project. That the barriers to entry are actually very low for groups, whether they be minority groups or fringe groups, in order to disrupt dialogue. So I know this isn't very uplifting, but what I want you to think about is actually the difficulties that we all find ourselves in navigating in this very complex environment. A complex environment that goes beyond what I'll say the traditional things that we think about that we have to do. Provide evidence, educate voters, and everything will work out. Right now, that's definitely not the case. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Geez, Nick, you're really a buzzkill with that presentation. But what I like about it, though, is that it gives us, I think, some tractability to start to think about where might we go when it comes to solutions. Now, to give us some perspectives around how some of these challenges are playing out in the energy sector, I'd like to invite Dale Boojum and Lisa DeMarco to the stage. They'll each be giving a brief set of remarks on their experiences, and then we'll move into a moderated discussion.
All right, there we go. Well, thanks, Monica, for having me, and thanks for the great remarks, Nick. That sets the stage nicely. So I guess I want to chat a little bit about the experience that we've had at Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission, because I think it fits very nicely into the story that Nick just told you. So Eco-Fiscal is primarily a panel of economists, of high-profile economists from all across the country who collectively agree that good policy can make sense for the environment and for the economy. And in practice, that has led us to policies that put a price on pollution and put a price on things like carbon dioxide emissions. And in some ways, those commissioners are the quintessential evidence people, the people that want one more fact and one more piece of data and are sure that if we can communicate that one more piece of data to the world, then everything will be fine. Fortunately, perhaps, at the same time, my commission also has a group of advisors, and the advisors are maybe a little bit of the symbol side of the story. And those advisors are people like former prime ministers and former premiers, former mayors from all sides of the political spectrum, from heads of oil and gas companies, from heads of NGOs for the environment. And the story there, the symbol there, is that all of these different perspectives can be on the same page. They can all agree. They can all support that strong evidence base provided by those economists. Now, for a while, I think we made great progress. We started about 5 years ago, and it felt like we were turning a corner, like carbon pricing was becoming mainstream and crossing those party lines at last and becoming a story driven by evidence and not by something else. And we saw a change in the world. We saw in Alberta implementing carbon pricing policies. We saw conservative premiers in Manitoba and a leader of the opposition in Ontario all promoting carbon pricing. Now, there was still debate. There was still debate about how to do carbon pricing, whether you should use the revenue you generate to invest in clean technologies, as Ontario and Quebec have done in their cap-and-trade systems, or whether that revenue should instead be used to cut existing taxes. Now, that was a good debate. That was a useful debate in which the evidence wasn't crystal clear. There was only one way to do it. And that was a constructive debate across those party lines. It didn't last. Now, we did some polling, and we've been doing some polling over the years, and we saw awareness of carbon pricing increasing. And with it, we saw strong supporters of carbon pricing increasing as well over time. But we also saw strong opposition increasing over time as well. In fact, we started to see some of that polarization happen. The more we were talking about carbon pricing, the more polarizing the narrative was becoming. So why exactly is carbon pricing so polarizing? Or maybe it isn't, but it has appeared to be polarizing. Part of it's about climate change as a challenge. Costs that are maybe in the future rather than now, and costs that are elsewhere rather than here. That's a barrier in itself. But it's also about the policy solution itself. That word taxes, carbon taxes, has a certain resonance for the audience that is hard to avoid. And in fact, all the things that economists so much like about carbon pricing, that price is visible and transparent, and that it's not picking a specific winner, is exactly what a broad population finds challenging about carbon pricing. It's visible and it's obvious, it's a tax, it's one more cost. And you can't paint a clear picture of the destination because we don't know exactly how the market will respond to those prices. So interesting tension there. But the other thing that I think that's made this conversation hard is the pervasiveness of myths and misinformation around carbon pricing. And I think that the myths around carbon pricing, that markets don't work, or carbon pricing won't affect behavior, or carbon pricing will undermine the competitiveness of our industry, or carbon pricing is inherently unfair for low-income households, those are not true. They are myths and misinformation. Well-designed policies can overcome those challenges, and it can do it well. But the answers to those myths are much longer and less bite-sized than the myths themselves. And that makes for an interesting asymmetry that's made our conversation, I think, increasingly hard. It's been easy to seize on those myths and misinformation as powerful talking points. So where does that leave us? Well, at Ecofiscal, we are continuing to try to push evidence into the conversation and continuing to try to have a better conversation about carbon pricing and about pollution pricing and about policy that makes sense for the environment. And that's meant trying to engage a broader audience in our work. It's meant trying to correct the record in the media when some of those misperceptions become prominent and repeated too freely. But I will acknowledge that it is a challenge. It does feel like an uphill battle. And at times, I feel some of the pessimism that Nick ended with there as well. That it's hard to engage that broad audience that is not necessarily the evidence that Ecofiscal has to offer.
Thanks very much. Dale has done a great job at highlighting how this plays out in the context of carbon pricing. It's an area near and dear to my heart, but I'll speak to you generally from the perspective of in the trenches energy regulation, which I'm sure you're well aware of. And in fact, I'm comforted to know that I'm across from many of you, some of whom I've cross-examined in the last week or so. So we'll touch base and follow up on some of the hardcore implications of what's going on and how this polarization that Nick spoke so eloquently of, Dale spoke so eloquently of, is playing out in the hearing room. How is it playing out in basic energy approvals and decision making? The first is in relation to the actual timelines associated with energy regulatory decisions. Not a secret that in late August we had the Trans Mountain decision. An appeal, judicial review was granted in that decision some 5 years after the application was filed. 5 years. And the outcome wasn't project denied, project approved. The outcome was, regulator, go back to the drawing board and reconsider these things that you didn't consider in the first element. First, marine transportation and the impacts on specific endangered species. And secondly, appropriately discharge your duty to consult in phase 3 with your indigenous communities. Took a long time. Took a long time to get to the point to say, go back and figure this out. And that has implications for investment and for associated economic growth in a country that has, as one of its fundamental sectors, energy resources that it would or would not, depending on the outcome, like to develop. But more than just substantively implications for the energy substantive decisions, there are also implications for the energy regulators themselves. What we're seeing is polarization result in almost a culture of fear and trepidation for energy regulators. We're seeing many, many more decisions appealed. We're seeing, regardless of the outcome and the pure legal fairness of the decision, allegations of bias, allegations of procedural unfairness, and a host of other elements that are really challenging how we as a society have come to know and trust in the decision-making process, in the decision-making makers themselves, and in the process for appealing those decisions to the courts if we don't agree with them. In fact, I would argue that we can go as far as to say that we're seeing a fundamental challenge to how we approach and respect democracy and the rule of law in the country. In, for example, Ontario, we saw two disparate entities appeal the same Hydro One decision. I don't think it's coincidental that there were a host of governance issues and ramped up polarized issues around Hydro One that led to a culture of distrust in the ultimate energy regulator's decision, and in part, contribute to both of those appeals coming from either side. Similarly, in the Trans Mountain decision, I think we've seen up to 7 separate judicial reviews in relation to that decision, largely as a function of some of the early challenges we've seen around allegations of bias of the National Energy Regulator. So looking at how we address Nick's 3 issues, and as a former science nerd, I noticed the acronym was FPU, frustration, polarization, and uncertainty. If you just rearrange those acronyms a little bit, it comes up as FUP, as in politicians, and I think we're seeing a lot of that come to bear, where regardless of who the decision maker is, there's a culture of forget it. That's a euphemism, forget it. We don't trust this decision and we're going to appeal it. And we need to somehow return to that post-World War II ethos of democracy that is rallying around collective action for something that is greater than any one single interest. The concepts of duty, the concepts of honor, the true trust in the rule of law need to come back to bear into our energy decision-making, into our broader public confidence. And so this is what we're grappling with as we go forward, and really why this project that Monica and Nick are working on so diligently, the Positive Energy Initiative, is so incredibly important, not just for energy, but for the country as a whole, and for us as a populace.
Thank you, and especially Lisa, thank you for that last little plug. That was wonderful, much appreciated. We will go to questions in a moment here, but I wanted to encourage a bit of exchange amongst our panelists. Before doing that, though, I have a couple of questions, or one question for each of you. So Nick, I had a research institute at the University of Ottawa that gives me a really wonderful catbird seat to look at a whole host of different sectors. So yes, energy is an area that I do a lot of work in, as a lot of folks in this room would well know, but I also get an opportunity to look at some of these issues that they're playing out in artificial intelligence, gene editing. I mean, take your pick, name your sector. You mentioned it at the outset. Energy might think of itself as special, but this is playing out in other sectors. Is there any, we've had a lot of negative thoughts here, and I think that's entirely appropriate, right? We're in a phase where we're trying to frame up, where do we go with this research agenda? What can we do to try to address polarization? So we're kind of in the problem definition phase. But are there any things that you see happening in other sectors, Nick, that give you some hope, ways that they're trying to grapple with these issues that perhaps we should be thinking about when it comes to energy, environment, and energy transition?
Yeah, in a lot of the research that we do, actually, if I was to, not to put myself out of work, but if I was to summarize 30 years of polling that people would have on a lot of public policy issues, it would actually just be summarized to people saying, don't mess things up. That's what they would say. You'd let me, go to work, let me look after my parents, let my kids grow up, let's have a nice life. I don't have to be rich, I don't want to be poor, but don't mess things up, government. I think for the sectors that have done a better job at their narrative, they've actually done 2 things. First of all, what they've done is they've advanced 2 narratives. One narrative related to choice, and one narrative related to stability. And I think this links into both what Dale and Lisa have talked about. That ultimately people want some level of stability in their lives. So if we were trying to position energy choices for the future, they should be framed in terms of a stable future as opposed to an uncertain future, because when you look at the polling, it's the uncertainty that worries people and makes them frustrated. So if you talk about an energy project and frame it from the perspective of this energy project will help create a certain level of stability in our economy, in the energy, our energy bills, in the future, that people will more likely be willing to accept that. And then the other thing is to get away from what I'll call the referendum syndrome. It's not about whether you like or dislike a particular energy project, or any project for that matter. It's about the choices that that project represents. So if you say, for example, let's just pick something, oh, you don't like power lines in your neighborhood. Okay, that's fair. You don't like power lines in your neighborhood. So what are we going to do? How are you going to get power to your house? And to change that, and I think, to Lisa's point, when she talked about kind of collective action, I think, when we've done polling, it's clear that people are willing to make sacrifices if they think it's for a purpose and if they think it's for a social good. But right now, much of the narrative is focused much more on oneself and on today. So I would say if there are learnings from other sectors that have kind of done a better job, it would be to focus on a narrative of stability and how good energy policy leads to stability in the economy, and then to also focus on choices, not to ask whether people like one form of energy over another, and have that kind of popularity contest, but to talk about, what is the right choice, and that there are choices, and it's not just about you accepting or rejecting a particular project in your community.
Great, thanks, Nick. There's some things you said in there I want to come back to. For now, though, I'm going to kind of move down with a couple of other questions, and then we can come back to those. So, Dale, one of the things that I've found extraordinarily interesting about the Ecofiscal Commission, and you alluded to it in your remarks, but I'd like to maybe ask you to elaborate a little bit on it, is the Commission is not only about the evidence, the Commission of Economists that are developing these, evidence-based policies, but is also about, as you mentioned, an advisory group that brings together politicians from a variety of different partisan stripes, from a variety of different levels of government. Can you talk a little bit more about what the role that, at least at the origins, how the Commission, the Ecofiscal Commission, what the thinking was behind that, and maybe then kind of a few years on, here we are now in an environment where it's increasingly polarized. Do you see the use of that advisory council differing in the future? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, some good questions. So I think that initially we wanted that advisory board for two main reasons. And one was to give us advice, to, exactly as the name implies, to draw on their own perspectives and their own kind of unique political insights and instincts in some ways that are the perfect complement to those commissioners in their economic and policy expertise. There's a little bit of politics, at least in an advisory form, to give us some guidance, to give those commissioners some guidance as to where the priorities should be, as to how we should be engaging with a broad audience across Canada. At the same time, I think that it did have a bit of that symbology. It was designed to show that pollution pricing and that carbon pricing need not be tribal, need not be defined by partisan boundaries, but that it was actually possible to agree on this thing despite some fairly fundamental differences in views on other policies. And the fact that all of them were there at the table was important in and of itself, in addition to the advice that they've given the commissioners and the staff over the years. I think that still holds true to both on both sides. I think that I've had very interesting calls with that advisory board, let's put it that way, and they bring something to those conversations that's pretty unique and pretty important, but grounds our work in the real politics across Canada, whether those politics are easy or hard.
That's great. Thanks, Dale. Lisa, we had invited you to participate in this panel to give that regulatory perspective. And if I think about, Nick's presentation focusing in on politics and elections, and Dale's, on the policy front, yours on the regulatory front, when it comes to polarization and the issues that we're talking about this afternoon, I often think about of elections as kind of the canary in the coal mine, right? Like that's the first place where we might see some of this really playing out. To my mind, the regulatory system, regulatory agencies, and the judicial role in regulation, that's the last bulwark in terms of to what extent, from a democratic perspective, are we an evidence-based, evidence-based decision makers? Because regulatory agencies, the regulatory process is evidence-based decision making par excellence. That's what it does. So thank you for your remarks, and I'm not heartened to hear how concerned you are, frankly, but at the same time, I'm not entirely surprised. You suggested that we should kind of go back to that post-war time when we viewed democracy in a particular way, duty, honor. What I'd like to ask you is the hard question of, is that possible? Given all the social and value change that we've had over the course of the last 6-7 decades, what's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it follows up on Nick's comments around stability.
Right.
We've been a little micro experiment in Ontario over the last 2 or 3 years about what happens when we go to extremes of either side. When we implement a system of a cap and trade system that is working, but it gets polarized and politicized, and from both sides. On one extreme side, there is a drive and push to get that last carbon molecule out of the electricity system, which is already the best among the very best in the world. 32 kilograms a megawatt hour, literally. It's time to raise your hand and declare success on decarbonization of Ontario's electricity system and to get that electricity into sectors with growing emissions. We didn't do that, and the politics went the opposite side. So we went full pendulum swing, carbon pricing, complete paucity of carbon pricing, $3 billion in assets, $3 billion in potentially stranded assets. That's not stable. Mm-hmm. And we're facing an energy sector that inherently is conducive to massive change right now. Distributed energy resources, renewables, wireless digitization technology, lots going on where the process itself can be conducive to stability. If we know every time you come before that regulator, this is what the process will be. They will go out and they will seek actual public input. They will have mechanisms to ensure that the public not only has a right to be heard, but feels that it actually has been heard. Justice has to be not only done, but seen to be done in that context. And so I think there is room for positive development, particularly around processes, particularly around how we make decisions that can, in fact, rally the troops around those democratic notions of duty, honor, with the resulting effect being some semblance of stability that eases the collective uncertainty that the world is facing in a rapidly changing sector.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lisa. I want to make sure we've got lots of time for questions because I look out in this audience and I see that we've got a tremendous group of many folks with a lot of experience. So I'm going to throw it to the audience, and I'll give an opportunity for the panelists, probably closer to the end, to say a few last words. I know that that's coming. If you could identify yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Monica. Jacob Irving with the Energy Council of Canada. Question related to the regulatory system in Canada. What's striking to me is whether or not Canadians know what they want out of their regulatory system. What I mean by that is that in the past, opponents to projects have looked at the regulatory system and have levied complaints telling regulators, you've never met a project you didn't like. They'll look at how few projects have ever been denied by any regulators across Canada. And it's a powerful argument, and it sort of makes, and it underlines this idea that the regulators are in on it with the proponents, and that the system's stacked. But to me, what it's always suggested is it's sort of like, how do you evaluate a teacher in a classroom? Do you evaluate whether or not they're a good teacher by how many students they've failed over time? Is that the right way to evaluate them? Or maybe nobody fails in the class because the teacher is good at bringing everybody along, and the end result is to have everybody pass through the class. And I think that us Canadians, we don't know what we want out of the, to me, the regulatory system is something that a proponent must go through, and that really should actually be guiding the proponent to keep doing better to get toward a final yes where all the boxes are ticked and all the right things are done. But it seems that there's a whole other view out there that, well, no, that's actually would mean the regulator being in bed with the proponent, and that what we must do is we must fail some of these projects in order to be able to trust. And I don't think there's any resolution to that, and I'm not sure how to get there, but it seems to be that there's a lot of confusion. Thoughts on that dynamic?
Great. Thoughts from the panel? We're all looking at you, Lisa.
I'll start in general. I think what we're seeing, particularly of the regulated public who participates actively, is a real dichotomy in value-based assessment of the pace of change. So those who have very strong values around we must address climate change immediately in this moment, now, will have a very strong leave it in the ground, deny all projects value-based system coming into play. And those who say we need to go through a transition, a slower transition, there's a job element, there's a collective element, we should approve projects to facilitate that smooth transition and to use our energy resources. The regulator is called upon to make a just and reasonable decision in the face of economic evidence, largely, but also of value-based evidence and positions of entities. Their job is getting increasingly more difficult because they're dealing with distributive justice on any number of aspects, particularly the Indigenous front, particularly the climate front. These are brand new issues that regulators have not had to grapple with to the extent they're dealing with now. But the point is, they have to make well-informed, evidence-based decision. And the evidence they need is beyond what we've traditionally seen. It's not just economic numbers at this point. We have to get in evidence that shows that people actually have been consulted, and that tells people who need to live with those decisions that, yes, we heard your views, and this is why and how we considered them and what the ultimate decision is based on those. And we're missing that now. And in fairness to regulators, tough job, brand new. It's not the work of traditional engineers and economists that we used to see 10 years ago.
Nick.
Yeah, you have to, so I'm not an expert on regulation, I'll start off by saying that. You have to think of the regulator as actually the intersection of good public policy and evidence and the public, because that's where the public slams up against, the project. And, I think one of the things that we've been sadly deficient, and I don't think Canada is any exception, but we've been sadly deficient at reminding people that, and reminding citizens that the role of the regulator is basically to manage risk and to ensure that the public good is a part of that. That if there are potential risks related to the project, the regulator, and this is just, I would just say just a fairly high level, the role of the regulator is to make sure that evidence is brought to bear so that all the different aspects of a project can be considered, and if approved, that on the balance of probability that it is in the public good. But I think when people hear regulator, they think of no action, not transparent, faceless, impersonal, not necessarily bought into stakeholders. and they forget what the role of the regulator is. Actually, when we think of regulation and regulators in every sector that make up kind of the country, that's their role, is to kind of protect the public good. So, you know, maybe we don't necessarily need to educate people on the specifics of projects, but we need to educate them to say, yeah, actually, this regulator is not just a little tick box, to kind of Jacob's point, just another little tick box, that it's already in the bag, but that they're actually there to bring evidence to the scene, to the table, to kind of review things, to make sure that the public good is respected, to bring evidence to the table in order to manage the risks. Because, you know, when we talked about, you know, people wanting stability, they're risk averse. When they think about these projects, they don't think about everything that could go right. They think about everything that could go wrong. So maybe we need to kind of reframe that particular perspective.
Next question.
Now, Jeff Simpson. Lisa, I have a question for you as a lawyer. It's going to be a provocative one, so I'll give you a minute to just reflect.
Provocative question from you, Jeff? Never.
I just want to remind us that although we are discussing our present difficulties around energy, etc., the 3 Canadian post-war governments were defeated largely on energy questions. In 1956, the Liberal government lost over the Trans-Canada Pipeline in the House of Commons and was defeated in 1957. 1979, Joe Clark was defeated on a budget that, among other things, had an 18-cent excise tax on gasoline, which the Liberals excoriated in the campaign and won the election. Subsequently, the Liberals introduced the National Energy Policy, which led to their defeat and massacre in Western Canada for a generation. So, in a sense, the politics of energy in Canada have been roiling us for a long time. But there are 3 new things, and you just touched on 2 of them, since the National Energy Policy. One is the court rulings, or at least the rise of Aboriginal interest in these matters, to say the least. The second is climate change. Neither of those issues figured in any of those 3 election defeats. But the last thing that's happened is the role of lawyers in the courts in this matter. We've just been talking, and you've just been talking, about many cases that get appealed. And the Trans Mountain decision was fascinating, for having read it, being an insomniac from start to finish, because in many, many respects, that decision congratulated governments for the consultation process, for the funding that they'd given interveners. They dismissed all the arguments from Burnaby, all the arguments from Vancouver. And they said, by and large, this process was very fair. But it said there were 2 areas. Now, that court did not consider any other issues than these narrow legal ones. Didn't consider the economy, didn't consider jobs, didn't consider the 33 groups that didn't appear before them that had signed agreements with the proponents. 6 did not, and they appealed. 33 did. They weren't heard from. So I'm asking you whether we have excessively legalized issues which fundamentally aren't legal questions. They're distributive questions of resources and power, and that the courts have been systematically unwilling to accept their own limitations in this regard. And lawyers are a contributing factor because, like all professionals, they want issues framed in terms of that they themselves can more easily understand as opposed to these other issues. That's the provocation.
I like the question. I like the question a lot because it gets into the meat of where we're going forward. Certainly, the whole concept of deference, and do we trust that first expert economic regulator, is palpable right now, and we're waiting on December 3rd for 3 decisions to come out of the Supreme Court to alter, very likely alter, the legality of the approach to judicial review in the country. And I expect that to have profound implications for what we're talking about. How likely is it that a reviewing appellate decision maker goes in and tinkers with the decision of an expert tribunal? So watch that space, December 3rd. There's a triumvirate of Supreme Court decisions coming out. But secondly, in terms of our role, before we start any proceeding, and there's one that's live right now that definitely, before we start any proceeding, I find it very helpful to remind myself that my duty, my obligation, is to be an officer of the court. First and foremost, to be an officer of the court, and to never put forward a position which is not supported in fact or in law. Particularly if you're playing the game for the long term, you must continually remind yourself that your job is to ensure that facts come to the forefront, that evidence is presented, of course, in a way that's favorable to your client, but in a way that is accurate and full and thorough. And I think by and large, the legal community in the energy bar has been pretty fair. It's one of the more collegial bars. It's one of the bars that actually comes to bear with compromise solutions, and we've seen this in a number of ways. But are there issues around judicial activism? Are there issues around grappling with how we go about distributive justice issues in the absence of policy? Absolutely. But when called upon to make a decision, the courts are forced to decide. They definitely have to and are obliged constitutionally to decide issues of law before them. And many of these are, in fact, issues of law in the absence of clear legal guidance to the contrary. And I think what we're seeing here, and your question really goes to the point of how much legal guidance do we need, and are we finding ourselves in a legal gap that needs to be addressed to facilitate decision-making by the appropriate entity, that being the government instead of some higher trier of fact or regulator who has to make it up on the fly.
Dale or Nick, did you want in on that question?
I'm no lawyer, so I'm staying away from this one.
Well, Jeffrey, I would just note that you would be pleased, I hope, to know that one of the areas that we plan to focus in on for the next 3 years of positive energy looks at roles and responsibilities, including roles and responsibilities between policymakers, regulators, and the courts for exactly some of the reasons that you've noted.
If I can just plant a seed.
Please.
Whither the role of the amicus brief? We have seen very little use of a friend of the court role by truly impartial, nonpartisan, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, Monica, entities. And I think that there's significant opportunity for that amicus, that friend of the court intervention, particularly in our country, where that entity does not have a political axe to grind.
Thanks. Lisa, next question.
Yeah, Patrick McCurdy, University of Ottawa. My question is where the three of you see the civic space that Canadians could go to get information about energy, about fossil fuels, energy transition. And I ask this because something which is missing from your talk, Nick, or I would add, is also the communicative element. Yourself, myself, who are designing communication campaigns, thinking about communication campaigns for various stakeholders. There's a clear shift from fact to emotion in the campaigning of NGOs and the campaigning of corporations. And so the other tension I see here is this debate versus campaign. And we want this civic discourse. However, very much the struggle over energy and the environment is a struggle of statistics, which are manufactured based on perspective. So I think we need to really reflect on the role of campaigning, the shift in the type of ads that NGOs are making, the shift in the type of ads that energy companies are making. I could cite examples, but I'll leave those for now. But the question is, looking at this communicative environment that we're in, the shift in discourse for these energy campaigns, where is the space for Canadians to get accurate, impartial information on this, on these issues? Where do you see it?
Good question. Yeah, Nick.
How about right here at the University of Ottawa? You know, no, when you kind of do polling on all the different players, politicians, regulators, civil servants, NGOs, all that kind of stuff, actually at the top of the list in terms of credibility are universities Universities still have credibility in our society. Academics still have credibility in our society. And that's why initiatives like Positive Energy and initiatives that are firmly grounded in scholarship and academia, that are perceived of as being, I'll just say, more independent than everybody else, maybe not perfect, but more independent than all of the others, with less of a profit motive in the outcomes. So, you know, I would say that's the sweet spot, because you're probably more likely to get people's attention if you have academia intervening. Now, how can we make that academics interesting? Different story, different panel. But, you know, if you can have, you know, I think scholarship, academia, research is probably one way that you could try to cut through the clutter, where you're more likely to get people at least to pay attention. They might not believe it, but the problem is that when you get outside to many of the other players, and that includes the governments, and that includes proponents, and that includes NGOs, there's just, whether fair or not, there is a suspicion that they're not necessarily all operating in the public good. But when it comes to academics, people don't make that same type of direct kind of connection.
Dale, this question seems like it was made for you, so please.
Yeah, I do want to jump in on this one. So I think EcoFiscal has tried very hard to be that voice in some ways, to be a trusted, credible policy voice. And we, as a result, value our independence above almost all else, and that we want to make sure that the decisions that we are making and the recommendations we're making in a report are purely a function of the consensus from those 13 commissioners. And they purely do come from the facts and the evidence. And yes, we may take advice from our advisors, but the decision makers for the commission are the economists. And as a result, we hope that we can drive forward with advice and analysis and recommendations and data that really is objective and impartial and nonpartisan. That being said, I think there is an interesting tension in communicating those findings, exactly as Nick has noted, that we have tried really hard not to be another boring source of data, but to try to engage with a broad audience and try to communicate those findings as broadly as possible, while still maintaining their credibility and sticking to the spirit and the evidence that the analysis has unpacked. That's a challenge as well. I think that it's hard sometimes to get outside your echo chamber when you are sticking to the facts and the evidence, and that it's easier to get clicks and retweets, etc., when you're being more provocative and more emotional and more symbolic and trying to appeal to a certain constituency. So I think that is an interesting challenge for sure. The last thing I guess I'll say is I think that the media still has a role to play here too, and that I think we're seeing the media get better and better at challenging statements that may not be entirely rooted in evidence, and to push back on some of those things. And I think that's a trend that I hope we'll see more of.
Lisa, did you want to?
Just 2 seconds. I'd just like to distinguish data and data analytics from narrative. We are definitely experiencing a paucity of a good repository of data in the country. When I need data, I go to the US Energy Information Agency or the International Energy Agency, and then I try and Canadianize what I find there. And the narrative around that, we need a big, at a minimum, repository of everything that we've got that's come forward in terms of hardcore data before any number of regulatory agencies across the country. And we need it for our traditional ecological knowledge of our Indigenous peoples. We need to start a process of recording and really having a great and rich repository of our Indigenous knowledge in the country. In relation to the last point that was made about being nonpartisan about that, and the media, this is where I get to throw one back at you, Jeff. I don't think the media has done a good job. Yep, he's ducking. Particularly on carbon pricing. For 10 years, the media reported on carbon tax or cap and trade. Cap and trade or carbon tax. there's so much more information out there. There's so much more of a nuanced story that we need to get into. And I know it's particularly, it's a little dry to read sometimes, but we need to go beyond a bifurcated, heuristic, yes, no, good, bad debate on some of our most contentious issues.
Great. We have just enough time for a couple more questions. We have 2 more up there, so please go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Stuart Muir. I'm from ResourceWorks from out west. And listening to the categories that are being constructed and are part of this over many years, one thing that recently I've been thinking about, and I'd like to throw it your way, is whether we, in talking about energy as a large category, are conflating in a way that isn't necessarily all that productive a great big thing, energy, when if you, say, split it into just 2 categories, one being energy exports and the other being consumption of energy domestically, whether a lot of the sparks that fly are because we're not seeing eye to eye within those categories or between those 2 categories. So, for example, people who might be very supportive of domestic policy changes are not wanting to play in that space productively because they are not seeing any gains for energy exports.
Thoughts from the panel on that?
Yeah, maybe I'll try with some trepidation. I think you can make different arguments about where to draw the boundaries of conversation, and in some ways, smaller boundaries may be easier and better able to define a specific problem in a specific kind of conversation. But on the other hand, maybe a really broad circle allows for more compromises and more pie for different stakeholders to each have a piece. And I'm not sure where the balance lies between those 2 things. I'm not sure that there is a quick or glib answer for a right or a wrong way to do it, but I think both tensions matter.
Yeah, if I could just add an observation, I would hazard to say that 40, 50 years ago, the energy dialogue was related to jobs and the economy. It did not include the environment, and that was not a good thing. And now we've swung, right, where we talk about energy, and that's all we think about is in the environment. I would hazard to say that a broader discussion that is more holistic, as opposed to thinking of trade-offs, would be fair and probably more realistic. That the paradigm of the past of talking about energy just in terms of dollars and cents and cost and competitiveness is incomplete because it does not include the environment. And the dialogue that just focuses on energy issues as straight environmental issues is also, from a research perspective and for most Canadians, incomplete. Because you know what? Canadians are environmentalists and consumers. They want clean energy, they want the environment to be protected, but at the same time, they want stable prices for their electricity at home. And they're cross-pressured. We should have a discussion that puts a spotlight on those cross-pressures, their environmental aspirations and their aspirations as consumers.
Thanks. Last question to you.
Yep. So I'm Helen. I'm with Student Energy. So fairly timely. Looking forward from this conversation. I think the big question mark now is what will this conversation look like once my generation is sitting on that stage or the generation below me is sitting on that stage. So we've got a great kind of multi-sector panel going on. I would love to hear from each of you from your sector's perspective on what you're doing, what your sector is doing right now to enable young people, 18 to 30-year-olds, to have a say in the decisions that are being made for their future with respect to energy, and what you're also doing to invest in their capacity to sustain things like strong carbon policy, improve things like strong carbon policy, improve regulatory processes with the upcoming generation. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Helen. Maybe we'll start at the end and work this way, if that's all right, Lisa?
It's a great question, and the point is illustrated. I gave a talk at Campwood last year about the challenges that the regulator faces in going green and facilitating green decision-making, and I asked the question, okay, in a room of about 1,000 people, raise your hands if you're a millennial. 2 people in the room were millennials, and so we're captured. The regulators are captured. Those of us who act before the regulators are captured. So that was a rally cry for myself to stop drinking my own Kool-Aid on a regular basis. And I did two things. I got much more engaged in young professionals in energy, which is those under 40, and young women in energy. And that's the other place where we're captured. I think we're still maybe 10% of the energy economy. So it's a really good point, and it's one that we all do drink our own Kool-Aid to a certain extent, and it's a point of humility. We need to be reminded of it regularly, and I thank you for doing that.
Dale.
Yeah, I'll echo some of Lisa's comments there. It's actually a conversation we had at a recent commissioner meeting. We asked ourselves how we could do better to be engaging with a younger audience, and I think it takes place at a few levels, and I don't think that it's easy to do at all. I think that, for one, my commissioners are mostly professors at universities, so have a direct connection to some of that audience in their classes, and they've made an effort to try to bring what we talk about at eco-fiscal meetings to their classes and to their students in a more direct way. That was one of the outcomes. I think that we have, more broadly as an organization, spent a lot of time recently trying to think about the ways we communicate to different audiences and where it is that audience, that those millennials and the next generation are getting their information. And we've been intentionally dabbling with other ways to disseminate our information, whether it is on other social media like Instagram and things like that my commissioners are absolutely uncomfortable with, but nevertheless trying hard to embrace for exactly the reasons you bring up.
Nick?
If I could just add, I'm really sounding kind of like a downer today, but when it comes to things like climate change, people feel powerless. It's like telling them that the ocean is boiling and what you should do about it. And, I would say if there's one thing that needs to change and one thing that millennials have to do that I think this generation is not, is to remember that small sacrifices and small actions actually add up to make a difference. Being a mathematician, I'm a big believer in compound interest. So it's kind of like all that little interest adds up after 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, and then you got something fantastic after that. I think if we could, I think part of the frustration when it comes to energy and environmental issues is there's also a sense of powerlessness, and we need a narrative on what everybody can do to contribute to achieve the objectives that we want to achieve, and so that they can participate in that solution and feel that maybe we haven't solved everything, but everyone can participate in doing one thing, and it could be it's like a community making what it would conceive of as a sacrifice, or a young person doing something positive in terms of advancing kind of, I'll say, the reconciliation between the economy and the environment. And I think that's the change that has to happen. Because as long as people think, oh, the regulators will fix this, we'll wait for another politician to give us an answer, it'll be somebody else's problem, someone else will pay that carbon tax, it will never work, right, until we actually get people engaged.
So 1 minute to each of you maximum, because we're at time, but I wanted to ask each of you to just, and maybe 30 seconds on one topic and 30 seconds on the other. So 30 seconds, when it comes to this issue of polarization, what keeps you up at night? But then when it comes to this issue of polarization, what gets you up in the morning? What are some of the things that you look to in terms of optimism? So 30 seconds on both of those topics. And Lisa, you're nodding your head, so you must have something that you've got in mind.
Yeah, choosing is the problem. What keeps me up at night? The inaction that ensues from where we're at on the polarization front. And I've been playing in the carbon policy realm for 20 years, and you put up a great graph today to show all the commitments we've made. Mike and Monica put up this great graph about every single Canadian commitment, and it was a path line of my career, literally. The first year I started working, we've not hit one, and we're not going to hit the current one. That keeps me up at night because we have to. If a country like ours, a country that by and large has a great democratic tradition and has a wealth of resources and has a great diverse population, can't get it done, who can? You know, so that keeps me up at night. And what gets me up in the morning? A lot of great people, a lot of good energy, and I'm very, very optimistic that if we just start communicating to each other, to people who we don't normally communicate with, and listening better, figuring out how the messages resonate and how somebody else considers things, we'll get there. Otherwise, I'd be crazy. You know, 25 years climate policy, I'd be crazy. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa.
You
Dale?
might still be crazy, Lisa, but I will echo some of that too. I think there's a very good chart in Jeffrey Simpson's book that he authored with Mark Jackert showing exactly that failure to advance, and that certainly worries me as well. And it worries me that even when we are doing the best we can to advance this issue and making real progress to push the rock up the hill, it still ends up rolling back down on us. That paralysis that we've seemed to face as a society in advancing good policy is certainly something that keeps me up at night. In terms of the optimism, I'm going to cheat and give you a couple here. And I think one is the very good conversations I have with individuals about this kind of content all the time, and that it's easy to get lost in these big macro narratives about society as a whole, and sometimes those individual conversations can bring a whole new perspective and a whole new light and a whole lot of optimism sometimes. And that ties as well to the question that was asked before about younger generations and the next wave. And I think a lot of those conversations are the ones that are most positive, and there is most appetite for doing things differently, and recognizing that, yes, shocks to the system aren't appealing to anybody, but we also can't stick to a status quo that we're on right now. Business as usual isn't a viable option.
Great. Nick?
What keeps me up at night? Two things. First of all, that there is no fundamental agreement on the diagnosis of the problem. You know, in the past, you know, when there were competing parties and there was an issue like crime, right, poverty, all those things, there would be a general agreement on what was happening, and then there'd be disagreement on the solution. We don't even have an agreement on the diagnosis of the problem, and that's a fundamental problem. The other thing that keeps me at night is that politicians and the media, with respect, feed on conflict and confrontation. Can I tell you, good public policy, bad for ratings, bad for politicians. It does not capture people's attention. So those are the things that kind of keep me up at night. A problem in regards to kind of a common sense of what the diagnosis is, and then an environment which amps up and feeds and lives on confrontation and controversy. On the positive side of the ledger, if I could kind of take a variation, I know Lisa talked about duty honor. Maybe it would be the fact that Canada, compared to most other places, is built on a principle of respect, that our country exists because it is pragmatic and we believe in compromise. Maybe as opposed to, you know, duty honor, that's way up there. Maybe we should just remind Canadians that what makes us great as an experiment, as a nation, at least to date, is the fact that we've been able to respectfully work out solutions. That we started off as a compromise, and look how wonderful that compromise has worked. And that maybe we should apply those very Canadian principles to this particular problem.
Great. Thank you. That leaves us on a little bit more of a positive note. So I'd like to invite everyone to thank the panel with me. What a terrific set of discussions. Now, for those of you who are here in the room, we have a reception and a little bit of goodies waiting for you. Prior to doing that, though, I wanted to make sure to give an additional thank you to the financial supporters of Positive Energy. I won't list them all again. I did that at the outset, but collectively, they represent Canadian energy from a policy, regulatory, and industry perspective across the sector. The other two people, very special people I wanted to thank, one is Dr. Marissa Beck, who helped organize this panel. She's the research director for Positive Energy and at the ISSP. And then the second individual, a very special thank you to Raphael Desordi, who's our communications and outreach specialist, without whom none of this would be possible. So please join me in thanking. And last but not least, thank you to all of you for coming. And for those of you who are watching us live, thank you very much for tuning in. Bye for now.